In the spring of 1944, the air war over Germany began to change its purpose. For years, RAF Bomber Command had carried the war deep into the Reich by night, striking cities, factories, ports, railway centers, and industrial regions that sustained Hitler's war machine. But by 1944, with the invasion of Western Europe approaching, the question inside Allied planning rooms was no longer simply how to damage Germany. The question was how to paralyze it. Germany still had armies in France, Italy, the Balkans, and the Soviet Union. It still had factories producing aircraft, tanks, guns, and ammunition. It still had commanders who believed that, if they could slow the Allied invasion and hold the Eastern Front, the war might be prolonged until politics or exhaustion divided their enemies. But beneath the steel surface of the German war machine, there was one weakness that could not be replaced by propaganda, forced labor, or emergency orders. That weakness was oil. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe could not train pilots or defend the skies. Without fuel, panzer divisions could not maneuver. Without fuel, trucks could not move ammunition, reserves, or food. Germany had coal, factories, and skilled engineers, but it did not possess enough natural petroleum inside its own borders. To keep fighting a modern mechanized war, it depended heavily on synthetic fuel plants, refineries, storage depots, and supply networks spread across Germany and occupied Europe. By 1944, those sites had become some of the most important targets in the entire Allied bombing campaign. This was why Bomber Command's role became more than a campaign of destruction. It became part of a calculated attempt to cut the blood supply of the Reich. The Americans could attack by day with heavy bombers and fighter escorts. The RAF could return by night with Lancasters and Halifaxes, forcing Germany to defend the same critical system around the clock. The target was not one city, one factory, or one battlefield. It was the fuel chain that connected every German aircraft, every armored formation, and every desperate counterattack. By the summer and autumn of 1944, the results would become impossible for German commanders to ignore. Aircraft stood idle. Training hours were reduced. Armored movements became harder to sustain. The war machine that had once raced across Europe was now being slowly starved from the sky. By the time the oil campaign moved to the center of Allied strategy, it was not born from theory alone. British planners had understood for years that fuel was one of Germany's most exposed weaknesses. The problem had always been reach, accuracy, weather, and priority. Earlier in the war, Bomber Command often lacked the navigation aids, aircraft numbers, and bombing precision needed to hit compact industrial targets reliably at night. A synthetic oil plant was not like a whole city or a broad industrial district. It required concentration, timing, and repeated attacks. A single raid could damage production, but only sustained pressure could keep the repairs from restoring output. By 1944, the situation had changed. Bomber Command had become larger, more experienced, and better equipped. The Avro Lancaster gave Britain a heavy night bomber capable of carrying immense loads deep into Germany. Improved navigation and target marking methods made concentrated raids more effective than they had been in 1940 or 1941. At the same time, the United States Army Air Forces were striking Germany by daylight, forcing the Luftwaffe to fight under a pressure it could no longer easily absorb. This created the logic of the combined bomber offensive. American bombers by day, British bombers by night, both attacking the same war economy from different directions. The Allied air campaign had already placed pressure on aircraft factories, ball-bearing production, transport networks, and the German fighter force. But oil was different. Oil did not merely weaken one branch of the German military. It touched all of them. The turning point came as Allied leaders prepared for the invasion of France. The invasion could not succeed if German armored reserves moved freely to the beaches, if the Luftwaffe regained strength over Normandy, or if fuel supplies allowed German commanders to shift divisions rapidly from one threatened front to another. The oil industry therefore became a target not just for long-term economic collapse, but for immediate battlefield advantage. Destroying synthetic fuel production meant that the Reich would be forced to choose between the needs of tanks, aircraft, training schools, transport columns, and emergency reserves. Every shortage would create another delay. Every delay would help the Allied armies after D-Day. The British role was crucial because Bomber Command could make the pressure continuous. When daylight attacks damaged a plant, night attacks could return before the repair crews had restored full operation. Germany was no longer being given time to recover between blows. Its fuel system was becoming a battlefield in itself, and in that battlefield, delay was becoming almost as destructive as fire. The immediate pressure before D-Day gave the oil campaign a sharper purpose. But the deeper reason lay inside Germany's own industrial structure. The Reich had entered the war with a dangerous dependence on fuel sources it did not fully control. Romanian oil at Ploiești remained vital, but it was vulnerable to distance, diplomacy, and air attack. Domestic crude production was limited. The answer Germany had built before the war was synthetic fuel, produced from coal through complex chemical processes at heavily engineered plants. These plants represented German technical skill, but they also created fixed targets. They could not be hidden like a battalion in a forest or moved like a railway gun. Once Allied intelligence identified them, they became the kind of target that could be struck again and again. For Bomber Command, this mattered because the campaign was no longer only about burning capacity away from the German war economy. It was about forcing Germany to spend its remaining strength defending the thing it could least afford to lose. Synthetic fuel plants required specialist equipment, trained workers, electrical supply, water, transport links, and repair crews. A raid did not have to destroy every structure to be effective. If it shattered pipework, damaged compressors, broke power systems, or interrupted the flow of materials, production could fall sharply. Even temporary shutdowns mattered because fuel demand at the front never paused. The German army still needed petrol. The Luftwaffe still needed aviation spirit. The Navy still needed diesel. Every day of lost production created a deficit that could not easily be recovered. This was the brutal logic that made oil more decisive than many other targets. A damaged tank factory might still leave existing tanks in service. A damaged aircraft plant might slow new deliveries. But a damaged fuel system affected weapons already built, pilots already trained, and divisions already deployed. Germany could produce machines, but machines without fuel became stranded metal. Allied bombing did not need to destroy the entire German army from the air. It needed to prevent that army from moving with the speed and confidence that had once made it so dangerous. British air power fitted into this strategy because Bomber Command had learned, through hard experience, how to impose repeated night pressure on industrial Germany. By 1944, with Pathfinder marking, improved navigation, and a mature heavy bomber force, the RAF could help turn oil from a protected resource into a permanent crisis. The Reich was not just being bombed. It was being forced to consume its future faster than it could replace it. The first major proof of this new direction came in June 1944, only days after Allied troops had landed in Normandy. Bomber Command was still supporting the invasion by striking railways, troop movements, and communications, but the campaign against oil now moved from planning into direct attack. On the night of June 12th to 13th, more than 300 RAF aircraft, mostly Lancasters with Mosquitoes in support, attacked the synthetic oil plant at Gelsenkirchen. The raid was remembered not simply because it caused damage, but because it showed what a concentrated night attack could do to a fuel target when marking, timing, and bomber strength came together. The plant's production was halted for several weeks, proving that these complex industrial sites were vulnerable if the pressure was accurate and repeated. For Germany, the danger was immediate. Gelsenkirchen was part of the Ruhr industrial system, one of the most heavily defended regions in Europe. If Bomber Command could hit oil targets there, then the Reich's fuel network was no longer protected by distance, darkness, or flak belts. The damage also forced German authorities into a pattern that would become increasingly exhausting. Engineers rushed to repair broken installations. Labor was redirected. Anti-aircraft guns were concentrated around fuel plants. Fighter units were pulled into defensive battles over targets that could not be abandoned. Every repair effort consumed time, steel, skilled workers, and transport capacity that Germany already lacked. This was where the oil offensive became different from ordinary destruction. The Allied goal was not only to smash a plant once. It was to create a cycle in which every repair was followed by another attack, and every recovery was cut short before it could restore full production. For bomber command crews, this meant returning to some of the most dangerous industrial regions of Germany under searchlights, night fighters, and heavy flak. For German planners, it meant defending an expanding list of targets that were all essential and all exposed. The consequences reached beyond the damaged factories. As oil production fell, the Luftwaffe began to face a crisis that could not be solved by building more aircraft. New pilots required fuel for training. Experienced pilots needed fuel for interception. Ground crews needed fuel to move aircraft, equipment, and supplies. By attacking oil, the RAF was not just reducing German production. It was helping to reduce Germany's ability to use the weapons it still possessed, and that made every future Allied operation more difficult for the Reich to resist. By late 1944, the pressure on Germany's fuel system was no longer an isolated bombing result. It was becoming visible across the entire conduct of the war. The Luftwaffe, once the sharp instrument of German blitzkrieg, was being forced into a defensive battle it could barely afford. Aircraft production still continued, and in some categories German factories could still deliver impressive numbers on paper. But aircraft on paper did not defend the Reich. They needed trained pilots, aviation fuel, maintenance, spare parts, and airfields that could function under constant attack. The oil campaign struck at the point where all those requirements met. For German fighter units, the shortage was especially damaging because pilot training depended on flying hours. A young pilot could not become effective by classroom instruction alone. He needed takeoffs, landings, navigation practice, formation flying, gunnery training, and emergency drills. As fuel became scarce, training was cut back. This meant that replacement pilots reached combat units with less experience, just as they were being asked to face Allied bomber formations protected by increasingly powerful fighter escorts. The result was a cruel cycle. Germany needed skilled pilots to defend its oil plants, but the loss of oil made it harder to create skilled pilots in the first place. The army felt the same pressure in a different form. German armor doctrine had been built on movement, concentration, and rapid counterattack. But by 1944, many German commanders were being forced to think not only about where their tanks should go, but whether enough fuel existed to move them at all. This was especially important after the Normandy landings, when German reserves had to travel under Allied air attack, through damaged rail networks, and with increasingly unreliable fuel supplies. A panzer division without petrol could still look dangerous on a map, but on the ground it became a formation tied to roads, depots, and ration movement. This was why the bombing of oil targets had an effect beyond the explosions seen from the air. It narrowed Germany's choices. It reduced the margin for error. It made every movement more expensive and every counterattack more difficult to sustain. British and American air power did not need to destroy every German vehicle or aircraft individually. By attacking fuel, they attacked the system that allowed those weapons to matter. The Reich was still armed, still fighting, and still dangerous, but the freedom of movement that had once made it terrifying was being stripped away barrel by barrel. By the end of 1944, the reason RAF Bomber Command targeted Germany's oil industry had become clear. Oil was not just another industrial target. It was the fuel behind every aircraft, tank, truck, training school, and emergency counterattack the Reich still hoped to use. British accounts of Bomber Command's later campaign note that oil and communications attacks became among its most effective phases, because fuel starvation helped bring the German military machine to a halt. This was the deeper purpose of the 1944 oil offensive. The Allies were not simply trying to burn refineries or damage synthetic plants. They were trying to make Germany unable to move, train, defend, and recover at the speed modern war demanded. By striking oil repeatedly, Bomber Command helped turn German strength into stranded power. The Reich still had weapons, soldiers, and factories, but without enough fuel, each became harder to use. When Allied armies advanced from the west and the Soviet armies pushed from the east, Germany was fighting with shrinking mobility and fewer reserves of time. The bombers had not won the war alone, but they had helped starve the system that kept the war moving. If you found this deep dive into RAF Bomber Command and Germany's oil crisis useful, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more detailed Second World War documentaries.